I'd like to welcome you to Oceans Alive this evening. We have a real treat in David Gessner, author of the book Return to the Osprey, is our speaker this evening. And I'd like to remind you there's one more lecture in the series next week. Ann Mulligan, an assistant scientist in the Marine Policy Center here at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, will be talking about her work on glacial history and contaminant transport on Cape Cod. Now, I know all of you are interested in David's book and David's writings on the Osprey, but before we start, Tracy Crago prepared a special introduction. So I'll introduce Tracy, who will then introduce David.
Good evening. I'll be quick because I know you want to get on with the real show here. I'm sure you're all here for a reason, and I'm guessing the reason is because you love Osprey and you probably have some Osprey stories to tell. But since Sea Grant's hosting tonight, I'm going to make you listen to the Sea Grant Osprey story. About 8 to 10 years ago, some folks in the audience, Bruce Lancaster and Rick Gallett and Jay Dufer, erected an Osprey pole outside our office windows down in the Coastal Research Laboratory. And we have a pretty nice piece of real estate over there. We overlook Trunk River and the Marsh and Vineyard Sound. And for years, we wondered why Osprey didn't think it was such a nice piece of real estate as we did. But about 2 years ago in the spring, an Osprey came by and landed on the pole, and we got very excited. And he came by for a couple days in a row, and then he brought the missus by. And we thought, this is it. They're going to nest. And I don't know, it must have been the kitchen was too small or not enough bathrooms, but they didn't stay. And last year, a pair did come, and they built a nest. And unfortunately, it turned out to be an unsuccessful nest. They didn't have any young, but they were absolutely wonderful to watch. And we became as excited as David did, as he portrays in his book. And I have to tell you, it was really fun for Sherry and I to read his book because it was great to see someone assign human values and emotions and characteristics to these birds. We did it every single day. The male, they were a typical couple, let's put it that way. The female, she was very, very particular. She would build her nest a certain way, and certain sticks just were not good enough. And she would, tamp down the bottom of the nest, and she was always demanding more fish, bigger fish, more often. And the male was a typical henpecked male. He spent a lot of time away from the nest, and when he did come back to the nest, he was aloof. Let's put it that way. They did come back this year. At least we think it was the same pair on April 5th. And they stayed around for a couple of days, but they decided not to stay this year, so we're hoping they'll come back next year. We've actually heard they might be over on a Quonset, a new nest on Quonset, so if you see someone that lives over there, tell them they've got our Sea Grant Osprey this year. I'm just going to read a short excerpt from the book that I thought sort of particularly captured the essence of David's journey of observation, and then I'll turn it over to you. Okay. Another day in June, I set up my chair and scope at Chapin before sunset. It's a cool, almost fall-like evening, and long shadows stretch from where I sit toward the nest. Though the tide is low, the shadows fill the creek bed dark blue like water. Even Barbie glows radiant. She has somehow turned a half cartwheel in the nest, so that for the first time I notice she wears sunglasses. You'll learn that osprey use lots of different things to build their nest. While I watch the nestlings, they watch the sky. Flying isn't too far off, and they are ready, primed and poised. In this light, the new golden markings on the backs of their necks shine full orange, a pumpkin orange. Despite a deep sense of satisfaction, something makes me glance up from my journal, a half thought. He should be back with fish soon. On impulse, I look to my right, and for the first time all year, maybe because of the dying light, I notice the speck that is the male before the nestlings do. This is a triumph. Sure enough, he flies past me to his post, with a fish whose flatness says flounder, until I see the spiked demon tail and recognize it as a skate, its white belly lit up with red. I again feel a connection with this, my favorite bird, though I remind myself again that the connection is only one way. As the male starts tearing at his chewy meal, I sit back and for a brief moment feel entirely at home. For once, the prospect of what I have to do tomorrow, the almost constant nagging and niggling of the future, of the imagined time when things will be better, subsides. I listen to the pulse of the ocean, slight but steady. And that same sound pulses through the golden sand, the olive spartina, the blazing nest. David Gessner.
Thank you. Thanks. Is this working? Thank you very much. I wrote some stuff down, and now I have to change it entirely because of the introduction. First of all, I'm glad you got the anthropomorphizing out of the way with henpecked and all those things. So now I thought I was coming into the den of science, and I was like, I wasn't going to be able to do that. And now I see I can, so I'm relaxed. And also, I've been working on a book with and about John Hay, the Cape nature writer. And one of his big lessons over and over again is humility, humility, humility. That we see these other species and we realize that we're not so unique, or maybe we're unique, but every species is unique. And he's drilling this in again and again. And I was like, okay, humility, I'm learning that. But pride occasionally kicks in too. Like when I saw the birds before the nestling saw them. You've got to have something to keep you going, like little victories that, so I'm a human being, and I have a lot of pride, and that is part of what helped me sit there and watch the birds. I wish I'd stayed with my prepared speech now. I was going to say that I used to be terrified of these talks, and when I was first doing them, I read a statistic that more Americans fear death than public speaking. This seemed very strange to me. But I was afraid of it. And now I've done them enough where I said to my wife, I think it was yesterday on the car ride to Boston, I said, I don't even get nervous for a minute anymore. It's so automatic. And then this morning, Sherry called me and said, Alan Poole, who's in the audience, was going to be showing up tonight to listen to me talk. And for those of you who've read the book, I leaned very heavily on Alan. I called him at one point my Obi-Wan Kenobi, my kind of Merlin figure. He knew the science, and he had written a beautiful book about ospreys, and whereas I was kind of a non-scientist, kind of groping my way along. And so the facts I'm going to be telling you, if they're wrong, and you feel they're wrong, you can go talk to Alan afterward, and he can confirm they're wrong. So anyway, I said to my wife, well, I guess I was wrong saying I'm never nervous. Now I feel like a little kid whose dad showed up at the school play. And Sherry called me and asked me to do this, and my first words were, I'm not a scientist. And she said, it's no problem. We do a lot of different talks here, and you're welcome to come. And then she sent me the list of different events. And I saw that the one after me was Glacial History of Contaminant Transport on Cape Cod. And I thought, great, I like birds a lot. And anyway, not only am I not a scientist, I've spent a lot of time doing talks. Anybody who's heard me talk before, claiming not to be a nature writer. I always thought of myself as very much a writer, and this will tie in with ospreys momentarily, but I just want to give you a little background about my writing. I banged my head against the wall. I spoke to an older group, the Dennis Yarmouth newcomers, and a couple of the best slides are still with the Dennis Yarmouth newcomers, unfortunately. But I spoke to them and I said, a lot of parents tell their kids not to be writers, not to go into the arts. And my experience, having struggled for 15, 20 years, is those parents have a good point in terms of working as a dishwasher, working as a book sale clerk, working at these crummy jobs. But then when things start to turn, there's nothing more wonderful than, as Frost said, uniting avocation and vocation. Then things start turning good, if they do. When I started to write, I wrote a lot of fiction. And I wrote about Cape Cod, and I wrote about the landscape. And I'd get these rejections. The best rejection I got was when I was 28. I got one that said a lot of mean things about the book, but then they said, you are a writer of considerable talent. And I pinned all my hopes and dreams on that one sentence. And some of the mean stuff or the constructive stuff afterward were suggestions on how to change this novel and how to open it up and how to make it have more consequences. So I followed through on those for about a year and a half, 2 years, rewrote the entire thing, sent it back to the woman, and got a form letter back. So this was like the typical battles Finally, I was at a graduate school. I'd lived in New England my whole life. I grew up in Worcester, spent summers on the Cape, moved down to the Cape after college. I was in graduate school in Colorado in a creative nonfiction. I'm sure people have started to hear that term, creative nonfiction class. And a man who became my mentor, Reg Sonner, looked at my stuff and said, well, you write beautifully about the landscape of Cape Cod. What if you just cut out the fiction and the melodrama and just write directly about it? And I did, and I came back. I took a sabbatical for a year, and I came back and lived on the Cape. And then I went back to Colorado and wrote a book about it. The year was a strange one in that I was recovering from testicular cancer. I was 31, and as the year progressed, my father was diagnosed with lung cancer, which sounds fairly gloomy and like a black book, but I think what redeemed it in a lot of ways was the landscape. And it also kind of dictated what direction I would start writing in. We were just talking about Bob Finch and John Hay, and my writing certainly is a lot more personal than theirs, and it's just the way it evolved. One of the things that I thought the book was about then was mortality, connection to place, family, roots, how place affects personality. So when the book came out, I was really surprised when it was called a nature book, and it was labeled a nature book. And it irked me a little bit to be like a nature writer, even though place was prominent in it. So I sat down and actually I didn't sit down. The book came out and I moved back to Cape Cod feeling that I'd be a big phony if I had this book about how much I loved the Cape and I was living in Colorado. So I came back to the Cape and tried to get people to purchase my book, A Wild Rank Place, which I also got a lot of flack for. The name, it's a quote from Thoreau, it is a wild rank place and there's no flattery in it. But everybody focused on the word rank. And I challenged them to come down to my house at low tide and take a deep breath and not have the word rank come to mind. Anyway, so I was irritated by the nature writer label, and I started a new book about my 7 years in Colorado. And one of the things the time there had taught me, again, was place impacting character. And having spent my whole life in New England, once I got out, I realized just how oppressive New England is. And this land of SAT scores and like Puritan fathers, and you're just like this. And I was suddenly in the West, and it was wonderful. And it was an exhilarating time for me. It's when my work first started getting published, and I put a lot of stock into this notion that the regions affect character, and I suddenly started to love, despite all the McDonald's and the strip malls, the fact that our different regions are so unique, and still, despite everything, have this character. So I thought that was going to be the message of the second book, called Under the Devil's Thumb, and the book comes out, and lo and behold, it's a nature book. So at this point, I'm starting to get really irritated, and I define, and this is not. I don't know if anybody's read Ed Abbey's stuff, or there are a lot of nature writers who bristle at the term nature writer, just because I think it's a boxing in. It's kind of like anti-biodiversity. Well, I'm a writer, and I'm interested in a lot of things in the world. But anyway, I was irritated by this, even pissed off at this point, and I sat down and I wrote what I considered my Declaration of Independence. It was an essay called Sick of Nature. And I'm going to read from the beginning of it. I am sick of nature, sick of trees, sick of birds, sick of the ocean. This is probably the wrong place to read this. It's been almost 4 years now, 4 years of sitting quietly in my study and sipping tea and contemplating the migratory patterns of the semi-palmated plover. 4 years of writing essays praised as quiet by quiet magazines. 4 years of having neighborhood children ask their fathers why the man down the street comes to the post office dressed in his pajamas. Doesn't he work, Daddy? Or having those same fathers wonder why, when the man actually does dress, he dons the eccentric costume of an English birdwatcher, complete with binoculars. 4 years of being constrained by the gentle straitjacket of genre. That is 4 years of writing about the world without being able to say the word shit while talking a lot of scat. And let's not forget 4 years of being the official nature guy among my circle of friends, of going on walks and having them pick up every leaf and newt and turd and asking, "What's this?" And when I, defenseless and less armed with my field guides, and even then a bumbler, admit I don't know, having to shrug and watch the sinking disappointment in their eyes. So this was going to be it. I'm done with nature. I send this out, and it wins a little award in a small literary magazine in New York called Literal Latte. They publish it. An editor for Algonquin Books reads it, really likes it, but particularly likes the passages where I write about Cape Cod, and calls me up, and here's the punchline, asks me to do a nature book. Which is how Return of the Osprey was born. One of the ways it was born. It was born more organically, which I'll get into. But she said, "You write beautifully about birds in the Cape." I said, "Thank you. I'm done writing about birds in the Cape." And I also pointed out that John Hay, I mean, one of the things about writers, you want to stake your original turf, your own place. And I live in a place where there are a lot of writers per square foot. And one of them, John Hay, has written beautifully about terns and other birds on the Cape. So I said, "No, thank you. I don't want to write about little birds, and I don't want to write about sparrows or titmice or anything." And then I took a couple weeks and I thought about it. And one of the things that factored in was the fact that she was offering me money, which had never happened to me before, in advance for the book. But another thing was I thought back more seriously to when we'd first come back after I'd written A Wild Rank Place and moved in to my family's old house on Sasuit Neck in East Dennis. And I'd gone for a walk. It might have been the first day, it might have been the second or third day, but I'd gone for a walk out on the jetty. And I'd spent summers in the house, and then I'd moved down after college for a few years. And having gotten used to Colorado and the scope of Colorado and the scale, the grandeur, it was strange but wonderful to be back on the Cape in the off-season. And it was, anybody who remembers this is 5 years ago. It was one of the most cold, I'm sure the Ospreys remember it. It was the cold, windy, miserable May. We came back right about today, 5 years ago. And I took a walk out on the jetty, and it was interesting, having been in a new place for so long, to be back in this childhood place where I'd walked for as long as I could walk, and I could recognize the birds, and I could recognize the plants, and it was familiar nature, versus kind of, it was still wild, but there was a wild familiarity to it. And so I went walking out, and as I got toward the end of the jetty, as I described it in the book, I think, a nearly eagle-sized bird lifts off from the end of the jetty, and I'm lost in my thought and lost in looking around. And I think I said it startled me out of self. And it was just such a wonderful juxtaposition of the familiar with the strange, and to see that the ospreys, I'll show you, not great photos, but I'll show you photos of this little lighthouse we have at the end of our jetty where the ospreys had built. And for the rest of that spring, as I was going around talking about A Wild Rank Place, they became kind of my familiar. And I would go out every day and watch with binoculars the jetty birds, who unfortunately, as I say in the book, nesting sometimes doesn't take. Unfortunately, the weather, I mean, we barely survived that spring. My wife had come to love and romanticize Colorado, and she was like, "This is what you've been talking about?" And since then, the springs have been, I mean, what was April like? It was like midsummer or something here. Let's see. I think maybe I'll go and just talk through the year. Okay, so just to keep with the biography, so I call back and say, yes, here's a bird I can get my teeth into, big swashbuckling bird that, that wasn't the first time I'd seen ospreys on the Cape, but it was the first time I'd really watched them. So jump 3 years ahead, and I call back my editor at Algonquin, and I say, yes, I can do this. And so it's about maybe late January, early February. And one of the first things I did, I mentioned Alan, is I went down and talked to Alan, and I started boning up on his book and everything else I could find out about ospreys. And I was given this lump of money, not a great amount, but enough to live on for 8 months. And suddenly I was being told, you're a writer and you can live being a writer, and your one goal is to become absorbed in Osprey world. And it was wonderful. It was a little strange at first, like it was cold in March and sitting and kind of waiting for them. But as they came back so reliably, the date I have marked on my calendar the last few years, it's like, it's March 22nd, then next year it's March 23rd. And it just came in, and spring came in with them. And as I go through the slides, I'll try to talk you through the year. I was trying to think how, in the new book I've been working on, I've been thinking a lot about science and how what I do is similar and yet very, very different than science. And obviously very many different kinds of science. And then I thought about the word that keeps coming back to me when I think about the year, which is immersion, which I think that the best scientists, the best naturalists, the best writers do, which is becoming completely absorbed in worlds. That isn't to say anthropomorphizing, whoops, I'm double miking now, but learning the world from inside out, as I said before, not saying that our world isn't unique, but appreciating the uniqueness of that world. I think I said in the book, I'm not anthropomorphizing, I'm osprey-morphizing, trying to get the feel of it. And as the year went on, that was a big factor, is trying to get more and more, as much as human beings can. We all have varying degrees of empathy. I think I'm about a 6.8. Somebody who was, my wife just wrote a book called Of Cats and Men, and she feels cats. She can do cats better than I can do ospreys. In fact, we had a running argument during the year, a very strange argument. I said, we kept arguing if she was 6 inches tall, whether the cats would attack and kill her or not. And she said there's no way they would. They'd know my voice, and they don't. And I pushed it, and and she insisted. And I said, well, if I was fish size, I have no doubt the osprey would. And now this is kind of a non sequitur, but I do want to talk about one facet of the book before I start the slides. I just decided this. And this is more about what I've been thinking about lately. It's a wonderful book by Jack Turner called The Abstract Wild. He talks about this immersion, and he talks about political action. Where I'm from on the Cape, that's a very naughty word. The Cape Cod Museum, Natural History, we love nature, but we don't like to fight for it. We're very nervous about that. And if anybody's from there and reports back, I'll be in big trouble. But one of the wonderful things about ospreys is, I think I quoted John Muir and talked about how when you pick up any one thing in the universe, you find it's hitched to everything else. And as I started to read more and spend more time with the birds, I kept finding these stories going off in all sorts of different directions. And one of the most heartening was the story of the actual return. I think, and Alan can correct me later if I'm wrong, I think we were down to 10 pairs or less in Massachusetts, and now we're up to 400. One thing that really was heartening for me, I had started to feel very overwhelmed by environmental concerns. I think in the book I said I curled myself into a mental fetal position because I felt there was so much wrong. Overpopulation, global warming, all these big issues that I felt impotent, like I couldn't do much at all. And one of the heartening things about the osprey story is the fact that we have them flying outside today that we just saw when we were dining is directly linked to a band of neighborhood activists on Long Island who in the 60s, inspired by Rachel Carson, I think Silent Spring came out in about 62, got together and started to object to the fact that they'd bombed the island over and over again with DDT. And finally, the Brookhaven, I can't remember, they became the Environmental Defense Fund later on. But this group of people, who I went down and interviewed, got together and took the Mosquito Commission from Long Island to court. And the tenor of the times was such, it's like mid-60s, late 60s, that the judge has to look up the word ecology in the dictionary during the court case. And ospreys being at the top of the food chain in the marsh are Exhibit A. And they got a temporary stay. They didn't win, but they got a stay. And in the meantime, public opinion shifts, and they no longer bomb the marsh with DDT in Long Island. Then they go on. I think Michigan was the next state, and by '72, DDT is banned. And the rise of the Osprey, the return to our area, is directly linked to that. And for me, it was a scintillating fact. It was just because of the fact, and I went down and talked to Art Cooley and these people, just because of the fact that they were pissed off enough and took action enough that, and it had these huge consequences. A local action had, it's like the bumper sticker, think globally, act locally, but it was brought home to me. And I started to slowly get involved in the often dull work of town meetings in Dennis. And I think it spurred me as much as possible to become a more political animal. So that's a part of the book too. And one thing I was just reading in Abstract Wild was to reverse the situation meaning the general apathy and this tendency to pull yourself into a mental fetal position. To reverse the situation, we must become so intimate with wild animals, with plants and places, that we answer to their destruction from the gut. Like when we discovered the landlady strangling our cat. I like that. So I think I'll go with the slides and kind of try to talk you through a little bit of the year without giving everything away. But let's see, forward. It won't take a year. Maybe a little bit more focused. Do I have focus here? Oh, there we go. Beautiful. One of the things I wrote about, and one of the things that you can't help but be impressed by, I'm sure everybody who's watched the birds, is this kind of marriage of savagery and beauty. I mean, you're seeing this wonderfully, 1 second you're seeing these beautiful hovering flights, and the next you're seeing them ripping in to often live fish. And before I had the slides and I went around, I did kind of a hand puppet type show. And one of my better imitations, I don't do the calls very well. One of my better imitations was of the mother feeding the young, where I think that was like the epitome for me of that kind of marriage of savagery and delicacy, because you'd have the rip, like tearing into the fish, and then just that delicate placement into the nestling mouth, gaping mouth. And I loved that. And I think, I don't have any great profound thing to say about it. I just think that was one of the things that really, really appealed to me. Many things did. When I told her, yes, I can write about a book about birds, the size, the athleticism, the aggression, the sloppiness, which I'll get into with the nest. All these things I kept thinking, soulmate. The back of my station wagon had garbage all over. I'm anthropomorphizing it. I'm sorry. No, I'm not. I'm just looking at them as a role model. Okay, a couple. I think we go back to these I used to. This was our house. Not the winter not the April we came back, but I think it was, what was the winter where everything froze up? 2 years ago or so. Whoops, I'm losing my power. Uh-oh. Well, we'll just stay here, and I love this house. Okay, go forward. We're in trouble. That's a good one. Now this was this is my friend Mark. He's kind of my literary sidekick, and this is the end of the jetty where the ospreys nested the first year I was back. But this is that 2 years ago where you could walk out for like half a mile on the bay. I don't know what it was like down here, but we had like ice floes. It was Arctic. Seals were floating by, lounging on pieces of ice, and it was wonderful. And I used to show these just to like kind of get you in a winter kind of mood, so that we get excited when spring comes and the birds come back. Okay, I'm not getting movement. So do I want to just, wow. And this is just I'm going to go through these pretty quick. This is just the ice flows by our house. Is there something we can do where I get this? Because then it would be fun to be able to, since you're all listening. And okay, I can talk about this one for a second. The reason I keep this on here is I bring up in the book many instances of the Osprey's commitment to place, from them coming back as 2-year-olds from South America and kind of having the burning image of place where they were born, and coming through some internal map returning to that place, to old examples of people having an osprey nest on the chimney and taking it down and burning it, and they keep rebuilding it until they finally, I think the quote in Forbush is something like, "Oh, we had to shoot them because they kept rebuilding on our chimney." I guess the option might have been just not using the chimney that spring, but I guess that's not possible. But this idea of intense commitment to place really weaves throughout the book. And my place, the parallel was, in my place that I returned to, not a great picture, I've got some later on, was this beach right by my house that I mentioned that I kept walking out to, and in particular this bluff. Whereas I write in the book, I seem to find everything. Is it working? Oh, it is my fault? It's my slide tray. And I kept finding that I would walk out to this bluff, and not only would I see so much, I'd see there was a decaying coyote carcass that I'd watch as it slowly decomposed. There were seals out on the rocks. There was all sorts of bird life because it was so rocky and jutting out. But after a while, I found that my writing was just immediately spurred by this particular place, to the point where I started to write using a micro cassette recorder, and I would write as I talked. The essay's kind of always been historically linked to the amble, the ramble, and it was wonderful. And a lot of the Osprey book, I don't know if are we stalled here for a while? Okay. A lot of the Osprey book, I watched the birds from March through the time they left in September, and I started writing the book, and I think I wrote most of the book in about a month and a half, 2 months, because I'd been holding back, and it just came pouring out, having forced myself not to write during that time. And a lot of it was written directly onto the tape recorder at that particular place. So that was kind of my home place, and it echoed with the Osprey's home place. This is actually from that April, walking out to the end of the jetty, and we can go ahead. Oh, the other way. I'm fully capable of talking for another half hour if it comes down. I'd like you to see some pictures of ospreys. All right, this is the end of the jetty. I've got some great photos later on. Unfortunately, this is my skill as a photographer, but you get a little sense of the precarious nesting situation at the end. I know you have some out in buoys here on the water, but this was a horribly cold and windy spring, and here they are. And you also get an early sense, I've got some better pictures later, of the kind of trashy osprey aesthetic, which I came to love. This is pretty early. They probably don't have their toilet paper rolls and their. We already mentioned the Barbie doll, which was like my, I was trying to I had a good list, but that was the epitome of bizarre osprey architecture. Is this one nest where they took back, and I was trying to be, in part inspired by Alan, I was trying to be a good field naturalist. So at one point I took notes and I said, is it a Spice Girl or is it a Barbie doll? I can't really see if it's, but it was quite strange, and it kept turning around, so you'd see those horribly pointy breasts coming in. Anyway, so, okay. This is an action shot. I did a whole lot of this. This is actually from that, just chronologically, this is the first year I came back when A Wild Rank Place came out, before the year. Okay. Oh, now we can't even see me. Okay. Just a few shots of them at the end of the jetty. I don't know. What do you think? They're not mating there. They're probably okay. Oh, we're skipping way ahead. Just to show you some, I just have about 6 slides of different kind of nesting place. I think I wrote in the book about how it used to be that the beaver was the dream architect for ospreys, because he would dam up dam up rivers and kill trees, so you'd have a dead tree jutting up where an osprey could build on top and have a great panoramic view around them and have water nearby. And obviously, waterfront property is a key factor in choosing a nest site. Okay. This is an unfortunate aspect. As I'm sure you've seen a lot of these around here. And at about halfway through the year, I got an email that said Osprey electrocutions that I thought was some, a cruel joke or something at first. And then I followed up on it. And it was amazing that she'd had 10 cases in Massachusetts of, often during wet weather of connecting and electrocuting. They're, as is obvious, they're incredibly adaptable. Okay. We got this down. This is from my friend Mark I mentioned earlier, took this out in Lassen, Volcanic National Park in Northern California. Just wanted to put it in as kind of a contrast to our nest sites. This to me seems kind of a dream site, and so many of ours, as the next one will show, I think, if I can make a motion. So many of ours, well, actually keep going. You get a little sense of the bulk there, but I've got some more that show that. It's time to get a new carousel. This is down in Sanibel Island in Florida. Oh, well, for some reason, the one I was trying to show you wasn't in there, which is simply, it might be coming up. It's simply, as everybody here knows, it's a joint kind of human and bird effort, and most of our nests are on platforms, very different than the one we saw in Lassen. This is a clump of something. Can anybody tell me? I've been trying to tell people it. Oh, I think it's vegetable more than animal. And I just like to do the kind of, since we already opened the anthropomorphizing door, I like to do the kind of the early nest building or often nest rebuilding process, which isn't always male-female split, but I guess with a lot of raptors, the female is often the patter down and mid-nest builder, and the male is often the gopher. And I think we already called him henpecked, so I'll mention that I called him like Dagwood Bumstead in my book, because there are actual instances that you cannot help but look and see, okay, she's going, and here I do my bad osprey impression, goo, goo, goo. She's going, get stick, get stick, get stick. He goes, get stick. She looks at it, fiddles around with it, throws it over, and goes, wrong stick, wrong stick, wrong stick. And he goes back and is off to get the next. And it's really fun to watch. We were talking over dinner, too, about housekeeping, which I guess with very young birds, even when the nesting isn't successful, when they do not have offspring, when it's not a successful nest, they go through the process of all the housekeeping process, like it's practice, basically. Okay. Oh, here we go. This is what I was looking for. Okay. This is my very poorly drawn nest. Somebody just said to me that they went and checked them all out, which is an ambitious drive from here. But the fun part is I had 4 nests that I checked on every day, and with real regularity. And the one I'm watching now is that harbor nest up top. And one of the real pleasures of it was that I could see it from my house. And so I'm going about, I'm getting my tea, I'm getting my business, and their life was so intertwined with mine. And that was a real deep pleasure. Another pleasure during the year was the harbor nest, which I'll show you next. I called them the ne'er-do-well ospreys, were younger, and they did everything behind the other birds. So I could be like the Swami to my family. I'd come back at the end of my day, and we'd have cocktails on the back deck, and I'd say, oh, this is what they're going to do soon. This is what they're going to do next. And it was wonderful to have them as kind of like bringing up the rear of these nests. If we go to the next one, this is the harbor nest. And they were young birds who who hadn't been successful the year before, and I really didn't think would be successful the year I watched them. As it turned out, they were kind of the surprise success story. But I called them the ne'er-do-wells, it's a big, ugly nest, and they just seemed to take it easy. You know, it was around this time of year, and I was like, come on, get going, show some urgency, and they didn't seem to be. And suddenly they kicked into gear, surprisingly late. One fun thing about this nest compared to the others is this is the off-season, but during the season, this is a crowded harbor, crammed with cars and boats and tractors and all sorts of noise. And it was a great example of the birds habituating. This nest, they seem to barely blink at all this noise and clutter and commotion, whereas the Simpkins nest next, which I'll show you a couple slides up, if I went out alone and kind of made myself clear, it was cause for great commotion, which I guess habituation is just a fancy word for getting used to what you're used to. I mean, like all of us. And so it was kind of fun. And this is, not an aesthetically pleasing nest. This was the big, ugly pole. Okay. I think we're going the other way. Okay, this is we're getting a little more modest. This is the Quivet nest neck, which I had great hopes for. It was kind of the opposite of the harbor nest, having watched them be successful the previous 2 years. And it was a nest where I put a lot of my time in early. And we'll go to the next one. Oh, here you're getting a little, I think at the beginning of the chapter on nesting, I called it like a Jackson Pollock cross-hatching, it's just, I mean, this is early too. I think this was an off-season shot. Right now, if you go out and study some of them, it's just, I don't know, it appeals to me in some primal sort of way. And I read in one of the books they could get up to a 1/4 ton. The ones I'm seeing are not anywhere close to that. Just some boat line and just other junk. This is just just keep going a little bit. Oh, this may have been an apocryphal story, but this is one I heard. This is the one called the lopsided nest, which you'll see in the next picture why it's called that. I compared it to the lair of the Batman villains in, whoops, I just waved my magic thing. But this fellow, Quentin Scott, who this was dedicated to, was out on the vineyard hunting with his falcon, and he died of a heart attack. And the falcon circled back around, and when they found him, the falcon was on his shoulder. And I found out about this because I'd been out on the marsh the whole summer without a visitor. And one person came out late in the summer, and it was a good friend of Quentin Scott. So it just seemed to weave in with the rest of the Osprey material. The next one's better, I think. You get kind of the lopsided feel here. And they lived their whole life at that angle. I always thought it was funny the way they corrected for it. And, okay, maybe we can focus this one. I was telling Sherry and Alan over dinner that I didn't know, one of my many failings during the year was I didn't know that they were banded, the ones I was watching. And the pictures I took, were little specks. And then last year when my book came out, the Boston Herald came down and did a feature. And this guy was 100 yards away taking these. And it was wonderful to get them back and pictures of them right in the nest. And I love the picture of you get a sense of the long-leggedness and the talons, and just imagine someone called it a boarding house reach. I think that's. Here's the lopsided nest. Yeah. Okay. Oh, this one's not so exciting to sit on, but this. Okay, I'll start to talk about immersion. Just get a big hook and pull me off if I go on too long. The process of the year, as I told you, it wasn't the most organic. It wasn't like I'd been studying ospreys for a decade and then decided to write a book about them. But one thing that really did start to happen during the year, which I loved and would like to do again either with ospreys again or with other animals, was this sense of sinking down deeper as the year went on. And it wasn't easy, and I really think that was a big part of it. Whether one is a scientist, a writer, a poet, the discipline, I've always found with writing that one of the great secrets is kind of keeping your butt in the chair. Sitting in front of the computer for enough hours where suddenly it becomes habitual and it starts to go and you start to get it. Well, with Alan's help, I started to find that about osprey watching too. One of my earliest and most major failings as an ospreyologist is I'd never seen the bird dive, something that many casual observers have seen many times and that I've seen many times since. But it was an embarrassment. I likened it, and critics attacked me for it, I likened it to being a virgin still in college. Like I was very embarrassed about my having not having seen a bird dive. So I set out on all these crusades up the marsh and looking for the bird's dive. And I'll tell you, the first time I saw it, I think I was as excited about it as, not as getting married or anything like that, but it was thrilling. And the dive itself, as probably everybody here knows, I don't think we have a shot of the dive itself, is a wonderful thing, very variable too. At the time I wrote the book, I thought, oh, there's a pretty standard pattern here. But I've seen so many different sorts. But the one I describe at the beginning of a chapter called The Dive is the kind of hovering, followed by the tucking of the wings, and the dive that almost looks like you're going to be going in head first, and then kind of popping a wheelie at the last second and kicking the long legs and talons. And if and after a fish is secured, one of my favorite moments is that there's a kind of rest and then the lift off, that heavy lift of the wings, and you see the water kind of, it looks like diamond sparkling as it comes off the wings and lifting up. And then as you'll see in some of the photos, as everybody probably knows, you've got that aerodynamic torpedo turning of the fish. Anyway, this was during my, I don't know why it's even on here still, but this was during my search period, which became a big part of the book. My friend, we can go to my friend Mark was a big part of this. He was always fishing while I was looking for the birds. And this was a thing that I was very pleased with in the reviews of the book, is they said it was one of the few nature books that had beer in it. I said, yes, that's very good. Okay. Now there's one coming up that you have to skip over fairly quickly because it's still, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. No, I mean back there. Okay. And this is it, I think. Go. Okay. For some reason that only probably a Jungian psychiatrists could decipher, I chose when I put these slides together to have a naked picture of myself in there. I've reconsidered, but I've been too lazy, I guess, to pluck it out. I don't, or maybe the exhibitionist in me. Anyway, at first I thought it was funny because I was naked, and then it looked like the osprey was hovering and about. But one of the wonderful things about kayaking and swimming and being right in the thick of it was getting the fish's eye view. I'm sure people here have seen them from right below and even had them dive close. And that's a wonderful, you talk about empathy and trying to feel the dive. That's a wonderful way to do it, is to be out there, nearby. And you don't have to be naked to do it. Though it helps a little. Okay. This is another action shot, thrilling. This is what I did a lot of. Amazingly, for a good part of the early season, I did not have a telescope. And the difference, I think I've got a couple. Yeah, this is, the difference was to, I think in the book I wrote it, their vision is 6 times greater than ours, and to suddenly, this process of immersion, to suddenly have the scope and have nothing in between me and being inside the nest was just, revolutionary from my own meager naturalist standards. As I started to do this, well, this is a good time as any to tell this part is, after I saw the dive, I was very proud of myself. Despite John Hay's claims that we should all be very humble, I was very pleased. And one thing I did was I called Alan and I boasted and bragged about it, as if he hadn't seen dives before. And I paraphrase now. He can take me to court if he wants, but he said essentially, that's all fine and well, but you've got to slow down. You've got to learn to live on osprey time. You've got to put in your hours at the nest. And my thinking was, and here again pride kind of worked in my favor, was if scientists can do it, why can't I do it? So I started to put in, I remember that they'd been on 4-hour shifts out on the marsh. So I started to say, okay, if I'm going to go to each nest, and at this point I wasn't watching the harbor nests as religiously because it was out my back door, I'm going to try to put in my hours and keep my butt in the chair, as I said about writing. And the payoffs were almost immediate. It seemed like it would be a great battle with tedium, because sometimes when I sat there for an hour or so, not a lot was going on, and I was getting used to osprey life. I kind of had it down where, let's say by now we're in early or late May, early June. We've got the female deeply nesting, mostly the female, though the male does his occasional stints, and you've got the male fishing and coming back usually to his little outpost, and then the female really saying, the male usually tearing into about, from what I watched, tearing into about half the fish. Seems like the eyes were a particular favorite for the male. And then the females insisting on getting the fish in that kind of insistence. Male bringing it over and watching this. So I was watching at the lopsided nest, the one with the Barbie doll. And I'd watched what I called a cycle of a feeding. And I forced myself to stay beyond the 4 hours because I'm not a great observer, but I was noting in my journal a difference in the way she seemed to be eating. At least that's how I put it in my early journal entry. So I was ready to leave. I'd put in my time, and I saw him coming back with the second fish that I'd watched. So I watched him eat his way through and watched her insist and brought back. And I watched her eat. And this time when she dipped down, I noticed the little reptilian head bobbing up, and I saw my first feedings. And it was really exciting. I mean, I tied a lot of my life into it at this point. And it was exciting later on to think about in terms of it being tied to that kind of enforced patience. I mean, when we say the word patience, we think, Zen monk, like patience as an easy, flowy type thing. But the difficulty of patience, that's why it's patience to begin with, is it's hard. And I found then, paradoxically, patience became easier and easier as more things started to happen. All of a sudden, you have, in 3 of the 4 nests, the one on Quivet was the one that surprisingly did not have young. You've got these nestlings, and you've got this gaping life where they're growing. I forget exactly what I said in the book, but it's like, it looks like a human year a day, because you basically go from the beginning of June till the end of June when you have birds almost the size of the parents. And it's so exciting at that point, and there's so much happening, and what looked like this huge, bulky nest is suddenly getting more and more crowded, that I found it much easier to keep my butt in the chair, as I said, and become more and more absorbed in it. Okay. This is a good one, catfish, and just wanted to give an idea of the kind of torpedo bay, aerodynamic, straightforward, and the eye too. Okay. I like that one too. We can go back to it. Okay. Now, again, like that unity of like savagery and beauty. As the month went on, the month of June now, all sorts of stuff was happening, and I was filling up the journal with pages, and all of a sudden, in way too fast a time, if I was in charge of evolution, these birds are practicing flying, the young birds. And 2 nests had 3 nestlings, and 1 nest had 4. And it was like a helicopter taking off, just this flapping, awkward. And here is where I got into that, once again, into kind of rooting mode, as I had been during the dive. I very much wanted to see them take off, and I wanted to be there when they first took off. But I couldn't possibly see how they would actually fly. It was the most awkward, unwieldy type, flapping. And so I was partly going, go, 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 and partly saying, wait, 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 wait. And when the first bird at the lopsided nest took off, I did a very small lap and kind of crash landed back into the nest to the general noise and acclaim of his siblings. It was another highlight to watch. Oh, here's the, now I don't have to do it like a puppet show. I've got it. Okay. Oh, this is, I didn't set this up. I used to be a cartoonist. And when we first sent the book around, I don't know if anybody's read Terry Tempest Williams' work. She's a Western writer. I think she's a beautiful writer. I've always admired her. So we sent her the book hoping for a blurb. And anybody who knows the inside game of writing, the blurbs that look so wonderful on the back when you read a book are usually the people, that the author drinks beer with or something. It's a very incestuous world. But with Terry, I tried to get a nice blurb. And she wrote, let's see, where is it? David Gessner's writing is not only a testament of hope, which was nice, but this is the part my wife really liked, but a beautiful bow to the osprey he lives among. I'll read that last phrase again. The osprey he lives among. And from then on, we were really into it. We said I should go on tour in a loincloth and like Tarzan of the Osprey guy. And it was around this time that we did another, see how I was modest? I gave myself big love handles and everything. It was around this time that I did another kind of strange experimental thing, which was I went up to the local fish market. I was friends with the guy who ran the fish market, and he gave me all different types of fish. And I took them, and I went for a jog, and I came back, and I was in my gym shorts behind the house. I took all sorts of lawn utensils like pliers and hedge clippers, and I wanted to get a feel. I'd been watching them rip fish apart. So I was hunched down, and I was tearing into it, and it was amazing how tough the bluefish was. All sorts of, every fish, I was having a hard time doing it. And my wife came out and just looked at me and shook her head and said, maybe this has gone a little too far. Time for the next book. Okay. Young bird, you see the white and checkering kind of. So once they start to fly, the timetable is somewhat preposterous because, these birds that I watched were starting to fly, it was getting late in July. And it's only a month or so later that on the nest, on this particular nest, the lopsided nest, the parents did something that I knew about from the books, but I was still kind of startled by, which was they left and made their 4,000-mile journey down to South America. And it just seemed to me, they've just learned, they're barely learning to fish, and now they've got to make their own way through that inward compass again down to their wintering grounds. Ospreys don't come back the next spring. They stay through a year and come back as 2-year-olds. And statistically, if my memory serves me correctly, a very, very high percentage come back to the same neighborhood. What they don't know is whether they more come back to the neighborhood and say, oh, this is too crowded, and head on to the next one. But just to think about that seems fairly astounding. Alan tried to explain it to me like, well, you would know your childhood neighborhood and be able to come back there and know your way around. Still, I think it's a fairly ambitious journey to head down there on your own. Winter, spend a year, and head back up here. The group I watched left almost right when the hurricane was coming up the coast. And it was just gave me a real intense sense of vulnerability of these animals. We don't need to see that again. It's kind of an old, this is from the Natural History Museum. I just like that one. I mean, it almost looks like a baton, but I know he's a... this is just, we were just talking about, at the beginning, I showed the bluff, and I described how intensely committed to it I was and how much the place had meant to me and to my writing. Well, a strange thing happened right when we came back 5 years ago. The beginning of this construction of this fairly horrendous and nightmarish trophy house on the bluff. So during the course of the Osprey year, I moved into a house that's the only neighbor down the hill here. And we were kind of like the serfs at the bottom of the hill, and there was this giant hill here. And I was astounded by how I had everything I loved, the bluff, the Ospreys. Out one way I looked out of the house, and everything I, to put it gently, didn't love in the other direction. And it really just, I mentioned how it stirred up my thinking about place and my willingness to fight for place. And I wrote an article called A Letter to a Neighbor, and tried to have a very civil and constructive discourse with my neighbor that deteriorated. And the one victory we did have was with lighting. He wanted to light, I mean, all the acreage, which would essentially have wiped out the night sky for us. And we did manage to cut back and get ground lighting. But it's been, I think, one of the great curses on Cape Cod is people's inability to leave well enough alone. And machines have been running in this place, and workers have been working for 5 years, and they're still going today. And it's just, it makes it hard sometimes to commit fully to a place without being somewhat heartbroken. And this is, to give you a sense of the scale, I mean, this is the biggest landmark in our neighborhood, and it's almost like it's riding its back down to me. He would love this slideshow. Okay. Oh, this is just a reverse. This is actually the bluff in reverse. I think we might be. Is that it? Did you go yes because it's over? Okay, this is just another of the Herald shots. You can turn on the lights too. So I'd be happy to work off questions, and if I can't answer them, I'm sure there are people in the audience who can, if they're Osprey specific. That fight, I mean, it continues to be hard to in the neighborhood I live, as I'm sure is the case with a lot of people. It's just to constantly watch beautiful old things that you value be torn down, and giant houses be put up that are muscling to the edge of the property that aren't being built for people or by people. They're being built by people who are going to then turn around and sell it to somebody. And it's just been, it's a never-ending war where I live. And the Ospreys and their territoriality and their aggressiveness seem to give me a nice symbol as far as doing battle in my neighborhood. Yeah. I'm sorry.
So did you become politically active and join the commission that you referred to in the book?
I did not join the commission, in part because the fellow who did, the one guy who was up for it had previously been on it and was the most politically active environmentally. But I've done a lot of talking and going to the town meetings. Unfortunately, whatever genes are inside me tend to be the more artistic, less political genes, and I'm trying my damnedest to nudge myself in that direction more and more. But I don't have a natural bent for it, so it can be tough. I don't think a lot of people do have passion for politics on that level, because there's no ego gratification, right? I mean, you're going to town meetings, and but God, is it necessary? And in our little town, I don't know if anybody's heard about the thing going on with Crow's Pasture, but it's kind of a better late than never thing. At least, hundreds of people showed up at the meetings, and this is relatively new for Dennis, and it was encouraging to see.
When you were doing your watches, were you a fair weather watcher?
No.
You stayed in the rain and all that?
That's always been something I've been pretty good at. In fact, I think the first year I was down on the Cape, an amazing, 1983 was the first off season. I mean, the difference between 1983 and is just amazing. And even stranger is the difference between 5 years ago when we moved back again and today. Is the post office where we are is crowded. And I remember I used to say, at least you can still have the place to yourself when it's rainy, at night, during the coldest times. And no, I was pretty good about that. Yeah.
Do osprey fish at night?
Alan, they do not, right?
No.
Is that? I do not think they do. I'm going to defer to you on all these questions. But no. It would be pretty tough, as good as their vision is.
I was wondering if you felt the urge to follow them to South America.
Well, I did. I'd never gone down there at all. I just, again, courtesy of Alan, I just went down to Belize, and we were going by an island, and he was saying, I think this is probably the southernmost osprey nest in the New World, or the hemisphere. And as if on cue, the osprey rose off the nest, and we saw it. And very different coloring, much lighter and whiter down there. And they are, another question a lot of people ask is, are there residential birds, are there birds that don't migrate? And there are, through Florida, through the Gulf Coast, there are non-migratory birds. And when I went down and started doing the talks in Sanibel Island, I would talk about the schedule they were on, and they were saying, no, they have young in December, they have, it's a whole different world.
Are there any identifying characteristics between the adult male and female when they fly?
When they fly, I am not sure on that, and I will defer to somebody who knows, but size is an obvious one, with the female being larger. I had a real hard time at first, other than size, with ID, but I got good at it. One simple thing, for instance, the lopsided nest was a kind of dusky element to the female who wasn't getting into the water much as the year went on. Alan, do you want to fire up on that one as far as flying differences? Serious?
They're hard to tell apart in flight. But as David said, the males, there is a size difference. In terms of body mass, there's about a 20% difference, males and females being bigger. Breastband is the easiest way to tell the sexes apart. The female tends to have a much darker chest than the male. But that's not 100%. There are some pairs that will line up, and it's very difficult to tell them apart. So bottom line is there's enough differences altogether to usually, in say 80 or 90% of the cases, to be able to tell them apart. But occasionally you get a pair that are tough to tell males from females.
You can pick up your speaking fee as you leave. Okay.
Did you say that the females do hunt for fish as well?
Yeah, they do, and it's not. I think this is my observation, and granted, these are only 4 nests, is that they're I notice differences from nest to nest. I think as the season wears on, and hunkering down in the nest, and the female takes over, it becomes the dominant incubator and the dominant kind of maternal presence, and the male starts to it splits up. It gets specialized as the season goes on.
Did you know whether young whether they're male or female?
No, but is size difference helpful there also? I mean, with the young, as far as, or you're at a loss because it's confusing because you've got the one born earliest, could be a male, and then you have 2 days later and female, and that was one thing that I did not go into because I wanted to not give away elements, but I did see some. My definition of pecking order was forever changed or made more vivid by what I witnessed in the nest. A lot of struggle. And from what I understand, in general, ospreys are not the most horrendously aggressive of raptors, but I did see some battles between them. Okay, anybody? There.
You mentioned you sort of empathize with the osprey, and how did you feel, or did you ever witness when an osprey is flying with birds, sometimes some other birds like crows will
Yeah.
try to make them drop the fish? Did you ever
Yeah, well, I didn't go into that at all, which is a really fun topic, an irritating topic. I mean, there's the whole thing about Ben Franklin not wanting the eagle to be the national symbol because of its pirate-like and tendencies, and ospreys and eagles coming into contact, and eagles harassing them into dropping the fish. And one thing I guess I liked, and it might be romanticizing slightly, but I liked about the osprey was this kind of pure athleticism versus, in fact, at one point I was thinking, I didn't include this in the book, but I was thinking the osprey is like the pro athlete, and the crows and gulls are like the agents getting their cut, waiting around. And then you've got red-winged blackbirds who are always so, territorial. And someone just told me one byproduct of writing this book is everybody comes up and tells you their osprey story. And somebody told me a story of, I think it was red-winged blackbirds, and the osprey finally getting fed up and going down, diving, catching the red-winged blackbird, bringing it back to the nest, and apparently giving it a scolding, because then 2 minutes later the red-winged blackbird flies off. Now, I very much question the story, but I get a lot of those. So. But yeah, it's constant, it seems like. And the other thing is I wrote, one thing that people have challenged me on, which is maybe a good challenge, is I wrote about the osprey's neighborliness a lot, in part because you've got finches and sparrows in the downstairs apartments of the nest a lot of time, and because from my understanding, the need for territoriality is less than your standard raptor because the hunting grounds are out on the water. However, the red-tail battles that I've witnessed and that other people have shipped in and told me about are fairly fierce and intense to watch, with that red-tail letting go that war cry as it shrieks across the marsh. And so they aren't, maybe they're not quite as palsy as I made them out to be in the book.
How varied is their diet?
Varied as far as fish. You mean?
Besides fish, crustaceans?
Well, there are a couple. Everybody always mentions in all the books I read, there's one or two mention of a muskrat or something like that. But it's essentially fish, and they're at once kind of specialists and opportunists because fish is for dinner. It's what they're going to have. But they are, for instance, right now the herring are running, and they'll key in on that, and it's what's there. But it's essentially, with some exceptions, noted fish. That's what they're eating.
Do the male and female come to the nest together?
Do they?
When is their relationship established?
Do they come together when they return in the spring? The pair I just watched were there. I know that a lot of times they do not, like the male will come first. Alan, you might want to take this one too. Looks like we're getting a lot more scientific and a lot more questions. But you're
fine. You're
yeah.
right on track.
That's what I noticed at my nest, and it's like the big ugly harbor pole. They came back, what seemed to be as a couple. The quivet nest this year, I noticed the male first, but that doesn't mean that the female wasn't resting on some other part of the marsh. So I think it is a little variable.
Can they come back to any nest, or is there any territorial?
The commitment to nest is strong, so often you've got the same birds returning to the same nest. Yeah.
Do you ever think you'll shake your label as a nature writer?
Well, I'm trying to write a novel right now. Unfortunately, the protagonist is an ornithologist. So I'd really like to, and there are a lot of examples. There's Peter Matheson, Ed Abbey, like people who, when you look at that page that I always like to look at, previous books, they have fiction in the list and then nonfiction. And so far, I'm very lopsided in the nonfiction department. But I do think it's harder now. Diversity in many ways is harder in this day and age, in part because of the crush of population. I do think it's harder to get unboxed as a writer now, because it's so damn hard to break in, and once you do, they pin you with something, and that's what they want from you. But it's just another struggle. I mean, you got to do it if you feel you're more than that kind of thing.
Do they mate for life, and if one of them dies, does the other one continue to feed the young, or what happens?
The phrase that one of the books, and Alan's book also used, was mostly monogamous. And I liked that because it sounded like human beings, but maybe a little better than human. As far as the feeding, I only have my eyewitness accounts to go by, and I didn't see one die. So I don't know on that. Is my answer. But you could probably find out from somebody after we break up.
What's the regulations concerning an osprey occupying a person's chimney? You mentioned it in your...
Oh, this was 75 years ago. I don't know. I do know that the last talk I gave, someone mentioned a similar thing now, and it's a summer home. And that's a problem. For instance, that nest at the end of the jetty was a problem because as far as habituation, you've got these birds used to essentially an isolated place, and all of a sudden the crush of people come in, and it's a whole different world. And with that end of the jetty nest, for instance, they went about their business with only me, back 100 yards or 100 feet with binoculars, and all of a sudden you have all the fishermen and everybody, all the kids coming in. So I wonder what's going to happen with that, actually, like the nest of a chimney. As I said to the woman who asked that question about this house, hopefully by the time they come, fires are not going to be at a premium. Hopefully it'll warm up enough where. But I don't know what the regulations are. Okay.
How'd you get the pictures and how far away?
I got the pictures, the less well-done pictures I took from a ways back. The real nice ones, the real close-up where you saw the band, were by the Boston Herald. Another group was of the beautiful ones where you saw the eyes shining were by photographers in Florida who specialize in nature photography, and they sent them up to me on loan for the talk.
How many copies have you sold?
How many copies have I sold? You're trying to bring me to a place I don't want to go.
I want to know how many other people have had the opportunity.
I do not. I think the printing was about 10,000 on the hardcover, and I think they pretty much sold out the hardcover. But we'll see what happens with the paperback because it's with a larger place. But I'm trying to think less that way, less entrepreneurial.
Just a question: how often are the ospreys injured by human activities? And secondly, what is a lot of birds of prey that are injured frequently go into wildlife rehabilitation. If they're permanently injured, they can go to different zoos, but you very seldom see ospreys in captivity that have been injured, or is there a particular reason for that?
Well, I'm going to go with I don't know for the second question. As far as the first, I mean, obviously the big activities that used to decimate them were hunting and egg poaching, and I think we're pretty much out of the water on those, I hope. And it seems to be, at least around here, a general attitude of encouragement, even when the oral irritation of that high-pitched cry are close to houses. Everybody seems. So I don't know. I don't know. Are my two answers. I said when I started this that I was going to use that when I didn't know.
It sounds like the osprey goes south after a few months, and then they stay down there for a year before coming back.
Well, the adults, who I guess have been recorded into their late 20s, but that's probably an extreme, come back the next spring. And our schedule here is late March. Near me, it's the end of the third week, early fourth week of March, leaving early September in general. And that's a yearly schedule. The only time it's not that, the only aberration, is with the young birds, the just fledged birds, going down there and then staying through a calendar and coming back the following spring. That's 2 years.
When they come back the following spring, have they already paired up?
No, I'm going to go with a no, and I could be wrong. They have not. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much.